Start the recorder. Well, I worked for a startup company a long time ago. It was really a nice, nice gig. I only needed to work. I only needed to meet with other people every Thursday. So out of the entire weekend, I think only every other Thursday, but it's in Palo Alto, and they always want the meeting time to be about 6 o'clock or so. So if you want to get to Palo Alto by 6 p.m., you have to start driving by 2:30 here.
If not a little earlier.
Oh yeah, it's bad. So it takes about 3 hours and a half to get there. There'll be like a 1 hour meeting. The meeting itself is only 1 hour. Usually there's not a whole lot of useful outcome out of the meeting. And then after that, we have a 1 hour, hour and a half dinner, usually at an Indian restaurant, and then it's time to go home. And then the trip home is like 2 hours and a half because there's no traffic at that time. So it's a pleasant drive home, but it's going to be it will take me like more than half a day just to attend one meeting.
What kind of startup was it?
The company was called iScale. I as in I, and then scale as in scalable scale. And I was the one who changed Squid, which is the proxy server software, so that it's kind of the early form of distributed peer-to-peer file distribution.
Oh, okay.
So this is prior to torrent, and then I found a way to modify Squid to do basically what torrent does. Except in this case, you're not giving torrent to individual end users, but as an ISP, you would put torrent or the modified Squid at multiple of your sites. So this way, people don't have to go all the way through the internet to grab something because it would be cached locally. And Squid is a really good platform for that because it's extremely efficient. The program is hard to read, but it's very efficient. So I finished all that stuff already by the time I stopped working at iScale. But they couldn't decide how to market it. They couldn't decide how to market and how to make a profit using the product. So they ended up folding.
There's also a liability. This must have been before Napster went down, right?
This is what?
Before Napster went down.
This is probably about the same time, but the issue was not even the legality, because the ISPs, we were trying to approach the ISPs so they can distribute like promotional videos and legitimate content that they want to deliver really quickly to the clients. So this has nothing to do with legality.
This wasn't for torrenting. This was their actual what's it called, casting.
This is for people to push their content. This is for companies to push their content. This is for Netflix to push their content, quickly, so that it's all distributed. There won't be a bottleneck. And then end users will feel, oh, okay, I can stream it really fast, but they're actually streaming all the way to the ISP because the ISP is caching, the more popular movies and shows and whatnot. So we were working on that, but they couldn't decide how to market it at the time. This is back when the internet was. This is back in 2000. Okay. People saw a lot of possibilities, but people could not decide quite what to do with it. We had a lot of smart people on the team. Most of the people were professors at Stanford University. So this is the kind of caliber that we are talking about. I'm just the grunt, I'm just the one who's hacking the program and doing the development stuff. But there were a lot of like super brain juice in the company. But I think that's also why they couldn't make up their mind, because they saw all the possibilities, but they couldn't pick one and just say go. Instead they just spent all day long thinking about the possibilities. But here's the product. I got Squid already done. We're still thinking about what to do with it. And then a few months later, the VC stopped funding the company. The venture capitalists, stopped funding the company, and they folded.
Think of the MVP.
Huh?
You should have said this. Put out your MVP. Oh, that these guys are like. These guys should have read all the entrepreneurial literature that came out in the last 10 to 16 years, even though it was impossible for them to have read that because it came out in the last 10 to 15 years.
Well, I think the problem had to do with, they have a lot of smart people and they have a lot of different ideas, but they just couldn't decide on one and just say go. I mean, if they just pick one and go, I think they could have succeeded already. It's just that they couldn't quite decide. It's kind of interesting. Okay, so what we are doing today is we are continuing with what we talked about last time. Remember what we talked about last time? No, not really. Has been too long. Yep.
Firebase.
Firebase. Okay, Firebase is one. So, okay, first thing first. Okay, this just occurred to me. Firebase DB does not replace TinyDB. Okay, each one has its own application because whatever you store in Firebase DB is shared across devices that has the same app installed. Okay, whatever you store into TinyDB is local to that particular device. Now you might want to have a feature where after signing in, an end user can upload the local preferences to the remote server. So in case the device got trashed, okay, they can reestablish everything really quickly. So that might be a feature, but there will still be stuff that you might want to store locally and not on the on Firebase DB. Okay, are there any questions about the differences between Firebase DB as opposed to TinyDB? TinyDB, local, Firebase DB, in the cloud. Okay. All right. So I'm not going to pursue in this direction too much today, but I want to kind of point to a direction so that for those of you who want to kind of look into this on your own, you can start to do that. We will eventually get back and talk about this later on, but not today. Okay. So what I want to talk about is, let me get into App Inventor first. So appinventor.mit.edu. And I'm going to use my default account. All right. So what I want to talk about is how do you run JavaScript inside App Inventor. Okay. If you don't feel that you have a need to do this, or if you want to wait until I present the actual solution, that's fine. If you have other things that you want to do in JavaScript and you just say, okay, I need to know at least the basic stuff of how to do this because I have something else that I need to do with JavaScript, I'll just give you a brief introduction to do that. So of the user interface, there's a web viewer, and then inside connectivity, there's a web component. Okay, so these two are different components. The web component under connectivity is what you need to connect to other websites, but not for displaying purposes. Okay, so the web component has mechanisms where you can formulate URLs really quickly. You can escape the characters, you can put in the parameters, you can use a GET request, you can get a POST request, you can send files over, you can get files from the other website, from the other side. That's what the web component is. But the web component cannot run JavaScript because it is not a visible component. Okay? So the web component is what you need if you want to deal with the API of websites. Okay? So you can mention some of the APIs a little bit earlier. ESPN, any type of news channel, weather channel, Dropbox, okay, anything that allows you to upload and download stuff probably has an established API. Google Map has an API, okay. So the APIs are basically all based on URL or Universal Resource Locator format, and you just have to know what parameter you need to specify, and what script to run on the other side. That basically is quote unquote the API to use these various websites. That's what the web component is, but that's not what I want to talk about at this point. It is the other one, which is a web viewer. Okay, so when you look into a web viewer, it's basically a visible component. Okay, when you drag a web viewer component into your app, it will be visible. Okay, you can define the size of the web viewer, and from the perspective of most end users, this is just a miniature browser in your app. Okay, which can be useful. Okay, for instance, if your app is quoting storylines or sentences from a website, you can use a web viewer to direct that content to some place on the web, so you don't have to build all that stuff into your app. So this is a great way to get resources online and display the HTML document the way it's supposed to be. Are we doing okay so far with the primary function of a web viewer? Yep.
Would this be the equivalent of an iframe in HTML?
I would say it's about the same, in the context of App Inventor. Yeah, but in the context of App Inventor. So it gives you a window that is basically a small, tiny little web browser. It has limited functionality. In other words, if you don't implement a back function, it's not going to be able to go back. So it's really good only for viewing, but not so much for interacting with the content that you're viewing. It can do some of the interaction, but it's not built for that. Okay? But what I want to do specifically today is how you can. Now, I will get back to this later. Okay, so if you don't fully understand today, it's not a big deal. What I want to emphasize is this part here. Let me just kind of magnify this a little bit. It's called web view string. Okay, so this is one thing that it doesn't look very interesting, but it is, because this is the one part where you can communicate between the blocks in App Inventor with the JavaScript that is built into an HTML document. Okay, so I'm going to draw a picture here. Okay, once again, if you don't think that this is useful at this point, you don't have to worry about it. On the other hand, if you think, hey, this is a cool mechanism, I might want to do something with it, okay, then you might want to kind of pay attention a little bit. Okay, so let's say you have an HTML document here, HTML, blah, 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 and inside it has some kind of JavaScript. And this can either be local to your app, it can be distributed with your app itself, it can be on the web. It doesn't really matter. The point is, this is an HTML document with some kind of script in it. Are we okay with that concept? Okay. You can build it into your app just in case. You're basically saying, okay, just in case the web is not connected, you have no connectivity, you have this document. Okay. So here's an HTML document. Something.html. Can be sitting somewhere. Doesn't even matter where it is. The web view, or the web viewer component, can basically just say, okay, I'm going to take this document and display it. That's the primary job of a web viewer, is to display HTML documents. But there's one more thing it can do. The web viewer component is an App Inventor component. And here's the rest of your App Inventor application program in blocks, right? So what you can do now is to have the blocks in your control inside App Inventor to specify the web view string property of a web viewer, and then when you engage the URL, this script can pick it up. This script can pick up the content of web view string. So that means whatever code you write inside here in JavaScript can get the content all the way from the App Inventor app. So you can do all kinds of computation, you can do all kinds of funky stuff with that value. And then when you're all done with this script here, you can also set web view string to a different value. And the resulting value of web view string as manipulated inside the JavaScript code can also be seen from your AI blocks, from your App Inventor blocks. So this is a really kind of cool way using the property of web view string as a conduit between your App Inventor blocks and your JavaScript code that you can include in any HTML document. And the reason why this might be useful is because on the web, there are probably tons and tons of code already written in JavaScript to do all sorts of useful stuff. Okay, I'm just thinking about Md5 and Md5 hash function here. Okay, but there are more than that. Okay, if you just look up JavaScript and just about anything, there's probably something that can do it. So what this means is, if you have any type of heavy-duty processing that you need to do, what you do is you take in those values from App Inventor, okay, using the text box, or some other means, put it into a web view string, specify the URL to an HTML document that has the script, corresponding script. The script will automatically start when you get to that URL. It will do the processing. When it's done with the processing, it can return the result through web view string again, which you can get back in App Inventor. So the context of this is I'm going to use this mechanism to deal with Md5 hash, so that we know how to store the passwords, but without storing the plain passwords. Not going to do that today. Just explaining the concept, because I can see some of you may see other possibilities in this kind of mechanism. If you don't know JavaScript and don't want to mess with this kind of thing, that's fine. You're not required to. But on the other hand, if you already know how to write programs or write code in JavaScript, and you say, oh, this is so much easier to do in JavaScript, but if I were to use blocks in AI, it's going to take up like half a page. Then you can just write some of the code in JavaScript and just have your AI blocks to interact with it. Are we okay so far with this? Yep.
You're saying that HTML file can sit on the phone as well?
Yes. It would be the same way as you upload your bitmaps.
Oh, okay.
So inside an app here, okay, so inside an app, okay, this is, okay, so when you get to your quote-unquote media, when you upload a file, the media is really a misnomer because it can be any file. It can be a text file, plain text file, can be HTML, can be PNGs, can be WAV files, can be movie files. We can associate any file with your app, including the HTML document that contains the script that you need. In other words, this can be a completely empty HTML document that only has the script to run and nothing else. And the primary objective is just so that it serves as quote-unquote a library or a component of a library of stuff that is computation heavy and you don't want to specify those operations in App Inventor blocks. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Just in terms of general concepts. Okay, so once we talk about the general concept, let me just talk about what is Md5 and why it is kind of like a minimum thing that you should do when you store passwords. Okay. So now that we have talked about lists and also key value pair lists, so we kind of know how to store, some information about end users, right? Okay, so let me just kind of, I'll do it, on the projector here, so it's recording. So now we have the means to do something like this. Okay. Let me change the font size because the default is really kind of small. Just want to use a slightly larger. Okay, that should be good. All right, so we now have the way to store, a list of key value pairs, where the key itself is the name of a user, okay, and then the value is its own list. So last time we talked about last name, first name, and that sort of thing. So we can keep that, okay. So we can say last name is Young, okay. We can say first name. Oops, I missed one more pair of parentheses here, because the value of TAUYEUNG is a list itself. That is a list that has key value pairs. So we have first name tag. So we talked about this last time, right? So now the question is, how do I store passwords? Okay. So the most obvious way to store passwords is to store the passwords as plain text. Okay. So I have one field here. The key is password, which means to retrieve this, I would use the key password, and I would just store the password by itself, as plain text. Okay. So let's say my password is secret, which is a very bad password. Okay. So you would store this, and then when you sign in, when somebody is trying to sign into your app, then you retrieve this entire list, and then you compare the password that is in the password field in your app against the actual password value. If they're the same, then you let that person sign in. Otherwise, you basically just say, okay, your ID does not match the password. Please try again. But there's one big problem with this approach. The password is stored in plain text, which means if somebody figures out how to interact with Firebase DB, they can get the passwords of every single user of this app in plain text, which also means they can now type in the username and the password and be able to sign in or authenticate as any user in the database. Does that make any sense? Not a good situation. You do not store passwords in plain text. So if I do not store the password in plain text, what am I going to do? I still need to store that. Okay, there's no question that I need to store the password somewhere, and I still need to match it. So what we do is what we call the minimum thing you should do is what we call Md5 hash. Okay, so you can look it up, Md5 hash function, and Md5 hash basically just takes text of some kind. Okay, like the spelling secret here can be used into the hash function. And what it does is it will turn whatever string you give it into some gibberish stuff. Okay, so let me see if I can just get a web interface to show you what kind of gibberish you're supposed to see here. Okay, Md5 hash web. Okay, Md5 hash generator. Okay, that's great. I mean, you just type secret, you click generate, go away, and it gives you this kind of gibberish here. Okay, this is I'm just magnifying the gibberish. Okay, so it turns secret, which is a string that we can see that we can remember, into some gibberish. 5EBE2294 blah 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 blah. Okay. So you store that in place of secret in the database. Okay, so so let's say this is how I do things now. So I'm going to copy this and go back into my document here and say I don't store the word secret anymore. I store the hash function or the hash value of secret here. Okay, but somebody can argue and say that hey, but that is still visible. If somebody is to hack into the database, they can still see this. Yes, they can still see this. But the question is it useful so that that person can sign in as me? Well, if that person types in 5EBE2294 blah 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 as the actual password, it's not going to match, because what is happening is when I try to authenticate someone, I will take the content inside the password text field, perform the Md5 hash on it, and then compare the hash value of what is entered to the hash value of what is stored. If they match, then it's good. If they don't match, then I just say that they do not match. Try again. Yep.
So is it hard to go backwards from the Md5?
That's a very good question. It depends on at which time you're talking about. In the past, it was thought to be difficult to go the other way around. In other words, given the hash value, can you find the string that came up with that maps to the hash value? That was considered difficult before. And now it is not. Because now we have the rainbow table, so you can just look it up. It doesn't revert back to secret, by the way. There are multiple strings that can map to this hash value. You just need one.
Yeah, so somebody can use a different password that it happens to.
Yeah, it so happens to have exactly the same hash value, and then that person can sign in. But it is better than not using a hash function.
Is there like this? Are there other hash functions?
Yes, there are other hash functions that are nearly irreversible. But I'm using Md5 because it's something that's easily done, and you can find JavaScript code to quite easily do that. Okay, you had a question earlier.
I was counting the number of digits. Is that always the same?
Yes, it is always the same because these are hexadecimal digits.
Okay.
So each digit is representing 4 bits. So the number of digits here, if you divide it by 2, that would be the number of bytes represented by this string.
Okay.
And that's always the same.
And you're always going to get 4 characters for each character that it's hashed. Is that correct?
No.
No.
I can have a really long string. Okay, I can show you that.
So it'll
So
hash it out smaller.
it will hash to exactly the same length.
Oh wow.
So if I
So there's no logic behind that.
no, there's logic behind it. It's just that it's not. So I can, if I generate here, it's the same length, same number of bits. So that's a really good clue that it is not a, okay, this is coming from the 440 class. This is not a injective function, which means it's not a one-to-one thing. Multiple input can map to the same hash value.
It is
Yep.
the one-way versus the key, which is a two-way, right? Password protection.
It is supposed to be, if it's truly one way, then it's good, but since it's not, we have a problem. Because if it's truly just a one-way thing, and it's difficult to map it back to what it came from, then it'll be secure. But the problem is we can map, a number of strings into the same hash value. So people, the hackers basically just kind of go through. They use a table. They basically just store all the possible things that can, all the hashes,
Okay.
and also
They
what
map it
makes
to all
that.
of them.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. So for those of you,
tables that he's talking about,
that's what the
typically
rainbow table
around
is.
16 gigabytes.
yep.
Wow.
Just to give you an idea, like I did this with Eric Shu what's his professor? Eric Shu? Eric.
Share.
Yeah.
Yeah. Ernest.
Ernest.
Yeah.
Ernest. And we played around with this in the hacking class, and they're literally 16 gigabytes. It takes like a day, 2 days to run through them.
But this is. But
you
this
will
is.
find it. You will find it. Yeah.
But the fallacy, well, okay, before it was considered, really hard to do because that's back in the time when your entire hard drive was 20 megabytes. And that's an expensive, internal hard drive. You pay $400 for your 20 megabyte hard drive. So think about in those days, even the government, even the FBI may not have the capacity of 16 gigabytes to store the rainbow table.
Gotcha.
So at that time, hacking or hacking based on the rainbow table or reversing a hash function or hash value back into whatever string that can generate that value, it's doable. Theoretically, you can always just redo everything, right? But it would take you a long time. In other words, by the time you get the result, the criminal that you're trying to get to has already died of old age. But because technology is advancing so quickly, 16 gigabytes still sounds like a lot today, but it's not. What is the smallest external, not external, but internal 3.5-inch hard drive you can buy from Fry's today? What is the smallest capacity?
28.
505.
How many terabytes? We measure in terabytes now. 1 terabyte is 1,000 gigabytes. So the rainbow table doesn't even use much room on the drive. It's like, it's nothing. 2 movies is already that much. That really is the scale of things now. So the rainbow table, you can just download the whole thing. Just put it on your own computer or generate it on your own computer because the computers that we have, the processors that we have today, are very high speed compared to back in the times when we had 20 megabyte hard drives. That's back in what, the 3D6 computers. Do you guys see why it used to be an acceptable way and now it's not anymore? Okay, it's just like WPA. Y equivalent WEP. Okay, so WEP, which is for Wi-Fi encrypting, so that your neighbor cannot share your connection and stuff like that, was considered secure by 128 bits. By today's standard, it is not secure at all. Somebody can just basically sniff the packets for half a day, depending on how much traffic you have on a per hour basis. They can sniff for half a day and crack your password. Easy.
We did that too in that class. I recommend anybody that's in the tech go to the hacking class.
I think it's really good to have people to take programming classes and security classes too, because this way we can connect the concepts, and it's really useful
You
that way.
understand what you're protecting against. That
Yep,
was the main reason.
exactly. That is exactly it.
But
Yep.
this differentiates then the internet security, which is a key password, right? A public and private key.
That is
password,
correct.
right? 'Cause
Yep.
you have to unencrypt on the other side, basically,
Correct.
right? And this you don't. You're just comparing the encrypted
Yep.
values.
Yep.
Okay.
That is true. Okay, so since you mentioned that, okay, so what is a better way to do authentication?
Through cookies.
Well, through an external entity where you do not transmit, anything You do not store, you only transmit the hashed value, but you don't see the entire table. Then MD5 is okay, because the MD5 hash values is actually stored on the remote site, and you don't get to see the table of the remote site. Unlike Firebase DB, where you download the entire, every single instance of the app is going to be able to see the entire Firebase DB. So the hashed version of the password of everybody is known to everybody else. It's just who has the ability to look at the rainbow table and find out what string can end up with the hash value. But if you have the other way, which is basically storing the entire database elsewhere, then the comparing is done on the other side. So your app doesn't even get to see the entire table. All you can see is confirmed or not confirmed. That's it. But we don't have the luxury to do that because I'm not teaching a web programming class here. So I cannot assume that you guys will be hosting a website and be able to do all that stuff remotely. But if you could do that, that would make it even more secure. So at least use MD5. Do never store the passwords in plain text. All right. So, yeah, go ahead.
So how would the other portion of unhashing it in your app work in that case? You store. Is there like you just have to use an Md5 function in JavaScript?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. So basically, what you do is you have two values to compare. All right. So this is your app. This is a screen of your app here, and you have a password field over here, which is in plain text, right? So you apply the hash function. You say Md5. You apply the hash function. So now it has a hash value. And then on the other side, from Firebase DB, you have okay. Here's a username. You use the username to look up in your Firebase DB to retrieve the stored hash value. So then you compare the stored hash value, the stored Md5 hash, with the computed Md5, and you say, are they the same or not? If they are the same, then you say yes, authenticated. If they're not the same, then you say nope. So that's why you never really deal with the plain text password other than just having it specified here, but it's not stored anywhere. It is certainly not stored in Firebase DB. So the key is if you find a function that is better than Md5, that is not reversible, then you have the security. You can actually store your password this way and not worry that people can look at the hashed value of all the passwords and be able to reverse it. Yep.
So you're actually in this process here, you're never actually like decoding your hash value. All you're doing is just getting it to save as a
That's
hex
correct.
and then validating against
You're not reversing the hash.
Okay.
You're basically saying, I store the hash value, I only compare the hash value of whatever the text box has, so you're never storing the actual plain text.
Is that typical, that process?
Yeah, it is typical.
I mean, even with web developments and server side, that's...
This is by default, how Linux does things too.
Okay.
So the Linux password file, or they call the shadow file, is basically storing the hashed version of the passwords. Now it's called salted, which means it is harder to reverse, but it is still reversible. It's just that when it's salted, because there are so many different ways to salt Md5, the seed of Md5, it makes it kind of difficult to find out which seed, how you salted it to begin with. But it is still reversible. It's not bulletproof. It's just more bulletproof. Yep.
And then the administrator protect that file too, right now in Linux.
That is correct. But
so
you
then you have to have some way to.
Right, so you have to bypass, all that security stuff first to get to the file.
Wow.
But once you get to the file, then you see the salted Md5, value of the passwords. But heavy-duty, hackers can still, crack it. Okay. Any other questions? No questions? Okay. If there are no questions, we're gonna. Okay, we can get out of this page here. So just remember, rainbow table if you're interested in computer security and how Md5 hash relates to security. You can look it up and find out what it does. So are there any questions about the mechanism itself? okay, well, this is all good, but where do I find the Md5 function in JavaScript? Because when you look up the Md5 function, it's really kind of, it's not rocket science, but it's not easy either. In other words, if I could just borrow code from somebody else, I would just go ahead and borrow code. Because when you look at the pseudocode, this is what it looks like. It's not complicated. It has one loop. Inside there are several conditional statements. And then we have a rotation of bits and stuff like that, which is defined earlier. And then we have this table here. It's a pre-computed table based on 2 to the power of 32 times the absolute value of sine I plus 1, which is basically looking at the rotation in radians and stuff like that. Okay, you can do that. Even in App Inventor blocks, you can do this. But there's a lot of stuff to do in App Inventor. So the next question is, okay, if I want to turn this into JavaScript, how much work are we talking about? Okay, I will show you exactly how much work is involved here. That is how much work is involved. And you can, the hardest part is to find which one you want to use.
That's my favorite site in the world.
Okay, GitHub has one. It's open sourced, so you just look up the JavaScript code, and this is just showing the div. Okay, never mind. Let's see. You can also just pull it too. Just download the whole thing. Then you have all the time in the world to take a look at it. I think it's just readme fixed node index. Well, you can't really see it because of the commenting, but that's it. This is the code. You don't have to do it yourself. Somebody has done it for you already. So your job is to take this, modify a little bit so that it refers to web view string, okay, or pass web view string to the function. When it's done, pass it back into web view string, and then you can pass it back to your blocks. Yep.
When creating a file to upload, do you want to use your common headers and documentation of the file itself? Like, should it be HTML or should it be a JavaScript file, basically?
That's a good question. You probably want to make it self-contained into a single HTML document.
So HTML with some script codes on the inside.
Yeah, you can just inline all the scripts inside the HTML document, because there's no particular reason why for the purpose of doing just JavaScript, running JavaScript, your HTML document itself has nothing to display. So there's no need to separate the HTML document and then use an include to get to the JS file. Just put the JS, all the content into the HTML document. Yep.
When you say you refer to web viewers, is that a variable? What is that?
Okay, so inside web viewer, okay, I think there are some examples
Web string.
Yeah, so web view string is a property of a web viewer.
It's a property.
It's a property, so you can set it, you can also get it. So you can change it, you can also refer to it.
So if your JavaScript, how does it set it to web view string?
Mm-hmm.
Is there like how does it set it
inside JavaScript?
Yeah.
Yeah, inside JavaScript, there's a special object inside that particular browser. Okay, because a web viewer is kind of a miniature browser.
Okay.
So when JavaScript runs inside this miniature browser, it has a special object called window.appInventor. So when you append web view string after this, in other words, when you specify window.appInventor.webViewString, then it's referring to the same thing that you refer to as web view string as a property of the web viewer object or component inside App Inventor. The big challenge is when do you know the computation is done, because the running of the code inside your web viewer is asynchronous to the code execution of your App Inventor code. In other words, you have both components working at the same time, and there's no explicit synchronization between the two.
No event.
there are no events to raise when the document is fully displayed.
I see.
So that would be kind of like one of the kind of icky things that you have to deal with. Most people just set up a timer, and then they have a special format, as the output. So the output always starts with, I guess you can always start with some gibberish, okay? So you always start with ASDF, okay? So then you periodically check web view string to see if it's starting with ASDF. If it's not, that means the JavaScript is not done yet. And if it does, then you know it is, the answer is right after ASDF. Because you just append the actual answer after ASDF.
Okay.
So we'll deal with that, when we get to this, when we get to that point. So I'll give you guys a canned solution to do Md5 hash, and then you can take that solution and just do whatever you want with it.
Is Md5 also used for file integrity?
Yes, it is. We use it as a checksum. In other words, we do the Md5 we calculate the Md5 of a particular file. Now it can be a huge file too. So what you do is you do the calculation of the Md5 of a file, and then on the website, next to the download link, you also publish the actual Md5 hash of that file. So when people download the file, they can run an Md5 hash function on the file to see if it matches what it is supposed to be. If it is, then there's a good chance that it really is that file. There's no guarantee. Remember, multiple things can map to the same Md5 hash.
Right.
So it's just a good chance that it really is the file that you intend to download. But there are ways people can spoof and change the content of the file. It just so happens to have the same Md5 hash. So it's entirely possible.
Okay.
Okay. Yep.
You can run a whole file through Md5?
Yeah. But that's how checksums are
I think
done.
that's why you see it like on GitHubs and other download links that you see the Md5 string.
And the
So that
contents
means-
are actually making the text?
Yeah, the contents is making it. So
Oh,
that you,
wow.
if you had a program or something, you want to make sure it wasn't
That's
a
how
virus
it's-
program or someone posted it, you can Md5 it and then check it.
That's how it's done.
Yeah, right there. So, Cyanogenmod is one of the alternative kernels for Android. So, on their website, when you download one of their images, it usually has an Md5 also. You can see this Md5 here has exactly the same number of digits as the Md5 that we have seen earlier. But this one applies to an entire file, that is one particular version of the Android kernel. So it's used in many applications, and also just remember this is just if it matches, there's a good chance that this really is the file that you're supposed to get, but it's not 100%. It's good for error checking. In other words, if you worry about transmission errors and stuff like that, it's good. But in terms of authenticating the actual source of the file, not so good. Okay, any questions about all this stuff here? Okay, no questions about it? Okay. So earlier, when we talked about Firebase DB, there was one limitation, and I think a few people expressed concern and say that, hey, I can't use it because I'm going to use the emulator, and the emulator does not, it only runs Android 2.0, or 2.3, excuse me, 2.3, which does not support the API for Firebase DB. I don't want to give anyone any excuse not to be able to use Firebase DB because they're trying to use an emulator that is not up to date. So what I'll do is I'm going to show you guys how to do this. I may not be able to do it today just because I don't necessarily have the space to install it today. We'll see. Okay, so you go to android.com, okay, and then you go to develop. Okay, it's usually somewhere.
Would it be fairly easy to use Knox's emulator? And just stop using are you familiar with Knox?
No X?
Yeah.
It's no X.
No X. Okay.
Well, I mean, you can call it Knox, but that's why it's called NOX. It's no X. So it doesn't require X window to be running first. So so it makes it lightweight. So you don't need to install X window, which is a whole big chunk of stuff, before you can run the emulator.
So can you substitute that for the emulator in AI?
You can, but you need to get an Android emulator. That's the thing. How do you get the Android emulator? Okay, so what we need to do is to download the Android SDK, or at least go to the Android SDK part here, and download and install Android Studio, which is pretty big. Okay, it says your operating system is not supported. See requirement, I have a Linux system. It should be supported. But if you run Windows, it's pretty easy. Okay, you just it would have displayed a link so that you can download it. And I'm trying to look for a way to bypass this limitation. It doesn't trust me. It doesn't give me a download option.
Go to past builds.
I think it's because you're not using GNOME or KDE. The first requirement it said.
Okay, let me see if I can find a link to do it. Okay. Yep, same thing. Complaints about your operating system is not supported. Okay, so let's check it. I do not use GNOME or KDE because they both suck. I use XFCE4, which is also what the Linus Torvald uses. So I cannot imagine why that would be an actual limitation. 64-bit distribution, I am using a 64-bit distribution that's capable of running 32-bit. I got GCC, GNU C library. I got at least 2 gigs of RAM. Oh, maybe it's the space, 2 gigs of available disk space. But it doesn't know how much space is available. So I'm not really sure why it wouldn't even let me download. Okay. Most of the time they have a download anyway link so that for those people who think you know what you're doing, you can still download it. I don't see it here.
If you went to like resources or prior builds, wouldn't you be able to download one of the older ones without limitations?
Well, it doesn't give me a link to prior builds. Okay. Let's close the ones that we don't need. Okay, this site uses cookie. Okay. I don't think it's because of the lack of cookies. Nope. Read the docs, see the release notes. That's just a release note. Doesn't give me a way to download. Okay. But anyway, I can't do it today. But this is where you can download Android Studio, and inside Android Studio is a whole bunch of AVDs, Android Virtual Devices, and they are up to date. Okay, these can run all the way up to the latest and greatest, Android operating system. Even your phone doesn't have. So go complain to AT&T or T-Mobile or Samsung. Okay, why am I still running Android 5 when the 7 is out? Okay. But they have the latest and greatest, and it's still virtual, and you can still use the development model that we have been talking about using ADB. In fact, it comes with all the tools that is included in App Inventor setup, and then some. This will take up some space, okay? Just one warning, it will take up some space. So if you decide to install Android Studio, make sure that you have enough space to install that, okay? I can't really demonstrate it today because it wouldn't let me even download. So I will have to download when I'm home. Hopefully it doesn't complain when I'm home. Then I can show you guys on Wednesday, what it looks like and how to get to the AVDs, the Android virtual devices. Yep. Question?
800 megabyte already. I uploaded it and installed it now.
Okay, sure.
It's like a gig though for every type of emulator you want is another gig. So
Yep.
you get a couple of them in there.
Yeah, you just need some of the more common ones.
Yeah.
You don't need every single one. Okay, so that's something I would like to talk about, but since I cannot show it today, we'll defer that to Wednesday. Okay, so getting back to the components, a few people wanted to write games, and a few people can utilize something that you have full control over the screen. Now, in a real Android device, you can do swipes and all kinds of stuff, regardless of what you're doing. But in App Inventor, the only place you can recognize swipes and stuff like that is under drawing and animation. You have to utilize what we call a canvas. Okay, so what we'll do today is to kind of focus the rest of our time on canvas, because some of you wanted to write some games or something that is really, really interactive, and canvas is really useful for that purpose. Before we use it, let's go ahead and check out the help file here, so that we understand what is a canvas and what it can do for us. Okay. So right here it says a canvas is a two-dimensional touch-sensitive rectangular panel on which drawing can be done and sprites can be moved. Okay, so let's go ahead and focus on just these two components. What does it mean when it says drawing can be done? So what you can draw include straight lines. You can also draw text. Okay, so those things you can draw at any pixels that you want to do. Okay, so you have a lot of flexibility as far as displaying text is concerned. You can control the font and the font size as well when you display text. You can also draw lines. Okay, typical lines. We'll take a look at all the stuff that you can draw in a canvas. But the most important part is inside the canvas you can have sprites. Now sprites are really cool, because a sprite is kind of autonomous in a certain way, okay? You can program a sprite to move in a certain direction at a certain speed. So once you say go, then the sprite will automatically update its own location in the canvas without your blocks telling it what to do next. Are we doing okay so far with that? So it's good for animation as long as the sprite is going on a straight line. If you want a sprite to not go on a straight line, you want it curve or something like that, then you'll have to use your own code, your own blocks to update the location of the sprite. Is that okay? So if you want to make a tank game where the tanks can shoot over a hill and use a parabola to try to hit each other, then you can use a sprite, but you cannot use the autonomous aspect of a sprite, because the calculation of the trajectory is not a straight line. So your app has to go through the blocks and use your own math to calculate at what time the shell should be at what location. Okay? So that you have to do by using your own code. Sprites have other things that are really cool. If two sprites are colliding, it generates an event. So if you can live with straight line travel, okay, and you have one sprite going one way, the other sprite going the other way, when they collide, when they touch, it generates an event. When they are exiting, when they're out of each other's path, it generates a second event. So that can be useful for certain really simple arcade games where, so if you think about the old arcade games, okay, where you move a spaceship, just horizontally, and then you fire projectiles, and you only have like 3 projectiles on screen at any time, they can all be sprites. And then the enemy ships can also be sprites, so that all you have to do is to say, okay, I'm launching this projectile at this time, and it's going to go in this direction at this particular speed. Then you don't have to worry about it anymore. So the next time you hear from this sprite is one of two things. One, it hits an enemy ship, okay? So you can check what it's hitting, and then decide what to do with it. The other one is it misses everything completely, and is now at the edge of the screen. That generates another event as well. So you can tell when you can recycle that projectile sprite to be used again. Is that making any sense? Okay. So a canvas is useful mostly because of sprites, but sometimes people like it because you can draw stuff anywhere you want to. Now with a sprite, with a canvas, these are the properties. You can specify the background color. That's pretty self-explanatory. You can specify a background image. Now that can be really useful, especially if you want your application to be like solving a maze or something. The maze itself can be the image. You can specify the font size. Now the font size by itself doesn't do a single thing, because all it does is to specify the size of the font when you draw text. Okay? But if you don't draw text ever with your app, then font size does not really matter. You can specify the usual stuff, which is the height, the width, and the visibility of your canvas. Just like a bitmap, you can control the size of the whole thing. You can also control the line width, which means when you do draw lines, how thick do you want those lines to be? Okay, this is in terms of pixels, in number of pixels. You can specify the paint color, because when you draw sprites, there's an option for a sprite to leave behind a line as a trail, and you can specify the paint color to specify the trail. Also, when you draw lines, paint color affects that as well. When you draw text, paint color affects that as well. So paint color is kind of like a universal paint color. Whatever you're drawing is going to pick up this paint color, which means when you switch from one tool to the next and you want a different color, remember to change the color, okay? Because there's only one paint color property. Text alignment determines the alignment of the text, drawn by draw text or draw angle. We'll talk about those later. With respect to the point specified by the command, point at the left, point at the center, or point to the right. So it basically just affects, when you specify a point and say, I want to display text at this point, is all the text appearing to the right-hand side, to the left-hand side, or is the text centered around that single point? That's basically the control that you have when you specify text alignment. It can be useful, okay, when you want things to look right and everything lined up, that can be useful. All right, so getting onto events, it has a lot. It has a dragged event, which means when somebody drag on the canvas, this event will be triggered. Now the drag event is really kind of interesting, because not only does it tell you where the current touch point is, but it also tells you where it came from. Because remember, with a drag, it means the hand or the finger has not lifted throughout the whole sequence. So you can actually tell, okay, I came from the previous point. If you have a way to remember that, you can actually remember the entire trail. This is also one application of a list, because every time you have a drag event, you just put one more entry into the list. So now you have a full log of all the positions where the finger has been on screen, which can be useful if you want to analyze what the end user is trying to draw. I think somebody in the class wanted to do a Pokemon Go trainer, like how to throw a spin ball. Okay, so this can be useful because you have to remember the actual positions before the flinging, right? So that means you combining the dragged event with a list to remember all the positions is going to be a useful technique for that type of an app. And then you have a fling or flung. Okay, a fling gesture is made on the canvas. It provides the XY position of the start relative to the upper left of the canvas, and also provides the speed, how fast the action is, and also the heading. So it's kind of a special type of drag if you think about it, because a fling is really just like that, but it's really a fast drag, but it's monodirectional. It's usually linear in one single direction. So it's reported as a flung event. When you touch down on the canvas, it generates a touch down event. When you lift up your finger, it generates a touch up event. And there's a touch event as well when the user touches the canvas and then immediately lift the finger. Basically, it's a click. Okay, the touch event is equivalent to a click. So with these events, you can kind of implement your own buttons. Okay, because you can actually tell where on the screen the end user has clicked. So you can basically say, okay, is that a place where I'm supposed to have a button? If it is, treat it as a click. Okay, so it does give you a lot of options, a lot of flexibility. The methods that it has, which means things that it can do, includes clear, okay, which is pretty easy to understand. It just clears the entire screen, so it doesn't have anything on it. But if you specify any background color or image, it will be the only thing on the canvas after the clearing. You can draw a circle based on the X, Y. These are the centers, and then the radius. And this one is filled in. Okay, when you draw a circle, it is filled. When you draw a line, you can specify the X, Y of the first dot or the first coordinate, and then the X, Y of the second coordinate. It will just draw a straight line between those. You can draw a single point if you want to. Okay, not particularly helpful because it only draws like one single pixel. Draw text requires 3 parameters. What you're drawing and also where you're drawing. And remember what we read a little bit earlier. When you use draw text, then alignment becomes useful because alignment specifies whether this XY here is specifying the center, the left edge, or the right edge of the text. So that can be useful. Unfortunately, Emulator does not tell you how much space that text is using. Okay, now that would be really useful because if it did tell you and say, okay, if it returns back and say, oh, the text that you just drew took up, this rectangle inside the canvas, that can be very useful because now you can say, okay, I want this area to be quote unquote clickable, and I know how big that area is. Okay, without that information, then you pretty much have to do your own experiment and find out how big of an area the text is occupying, and then you just say, okay, that area is useful or important. So it's kind of a drawback that it doesn't do that. Draw text at angle is kind of like draw text, except you can also specify the angle that is specified in number of degrees, which is from 0 to 359. You can get background pixel color. In other words, you can get the color that is behind the XY coordinate that is in the background. So even if you have painted stuff over it, this always tells you what is way, way, way behind that dot, okay, before you paint anything. So this can be useful when you're dealing with a maze, type of a game, because when you deal with a maze game, what you can do is you can draw the mazes as bitmaps. So as the end user navigates, whatever thing is supposed to go through the maze, every single time you try to move to the next location, you check the background color of the new location and say, is that color a wall or is that color a real background? Okay. Yep.
Will that work on an image? Will that grab the background color of the image and
Yes.
the location of the point that you're at?
Yep.
Okay.
So we can put the image on the canvas?
Yes. So you use the image as the background of the canvas.
Okay.
To make use of this function, that image has to be quote unquote the background of the canvas.
So it's going to take up the whole canvas?
It will take up the whole canvas.
Okay.
Right. But you can still crop it and and control which portion has the actual image, because you can fill it up with some extra space that has nothing on it.
That's something. Okay.
Yep.
So if you were to make like a photo that's made like a maze, since we're talking about mazes, in Photoshop, and you make it just black and white so that you can make your lines and the walls really, you can use those colors to determine where the sprite would be able to go.
Right. Yep.
Okay.
But you have to be careful because you don't want the end user to be able to jump across a wall. In other words, you're not just following the action of the end user. You basically have to go, okay, if the end user specifies that the sprite should go from here to here, don't make that quantum jump, okay? In your code, draw that line and then check every single dot in between and see whether it hits a wall or not. Because otherwise, it would be a quantum jump because this location is the background, this location is the background, but the wall is in between. So if someone is to really, really fast move from one location to the next, you can jump across a wall.
Okay.
So no quantum effect, Or you might want to make that a part of the game is you enable the quantum jump effect ability, but if they fail to make that quantum jump, then they would die horribly.
or at a certain speed. In order to get there, you have to do a certain speed. That's cool.
Yes. But you have the ability to do that, basically. Get pixel color is just whatever is on the pixel at the time. So what you need to do is to differentiate between get background pixel color as opposed to get pixel color. The background is all the way in the canvas, okay? But you can paint your text, lines, circles, and stuff over that. If you use get background pixel color, it's getting the actual background color, which is all the way in the back. Not what you're seeing, but what is all the way in the background. When you use get pixel color, it will be what you're seeing. So if you have painted other stuff on top of the background image, then whatever you paint over is whatever the pixel color is going to return. But if you want to know what is behind that, then you have to use get background pixel color. That's the difference between these two. Okay, so depending on what you want to do, one or the other may be useful. Okay, like you can make a Tron game, right? How many people know what is a Tron game? Okay, so you ride a motorcycle, it leaves behind a trail, and you cannot run into the trail of another bike. And I think there's a decay too. Is that usually the case where the trail has a decay?
It has a variant, but in pure variants, there shouldn't be a decay.
Okay, so without any decay, isn't that game also called Snake?
Basically.
Snake
Yeah.
has decay. So,
Snake has decay?
Yeah.
Okay. So Snake is one that has decay, and then Tron is kind of the one
Your
without
tail gets
decay.
longer and longer.
Yeah.
Because you need more.
Yeah.
Yep. So if you want to make a game like that, then you want to pay attention to get pixel color, not get background pixel color. If you want to make a maze, now with a maze it's kind of a funny thing, because if you want to pre-make the mazes based on images, then you want to use background color. On the other hand, if you make your algorithm to dynamically generate the maze, then you want to use get pixel color. Is that making any sense? So it's up to you guys to decide. I think I remember at least one app trying to make a maze game. Okay, so that would be kind of useful. You can also make for that particular app. I'm not saying that you should do it that way. Then you can also make it so that it responds to the tilt of the phone. I mean, there are multiple games like that already. It resembles those kind of like old standalone maze game. How many people know what I'm talking about? There's a little ball bearing in the thing with this plastic key. Yeah.
Labyrinth, I think.
Yeah.
Oh,
And
I was thinking of the wooden one with the
Yeah.
two knobs.
That's what I was thinking of. Yeah.
Now I'm talking about the ones that you can put in the keychain. So it's only about yay
Oh,
big.
yeah, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Circles and squares,
Yeah. So kids. When I was a kid, I used to spend a lot of time in class doing that instead of paying attention. But you can now do that virtually because your phone has accelerometer, so you can actually see how much it's tilting to one side. So you can make the ball basically a sprite to respond to that. But then you have to figure out the mechanism to follow an edge, because that's what the real thing does. You can save the bitmap. Okay, you can save the what is in the canvas at a time. Okay, so you can quite easily make a drawing app, for instance. Okay, you can make a drawing app where people can pick a tool like a pen, stamps, and stuff like that. Draw whatever they want on the canvas, and then be able to save it. So it would be kind of cool for a kids kind of app where kids can draw stuff. Okay, so in addition to taking a picture, you can also have the kids to be able to kind of paint over stuff, circle things that are important, that sort of thing. So when you save, how come it only gives you back the text? Well, it's supposed to be an image. Well, you cannot get the actual image itself, but you can get the file name corresponding to the image. That's what the text is. It's really the file name of the thing. Now, once you have the file name of the image, then you can use other means to either share the file. Okay, you can just click the share thing, use the share component. So now you can share it with text, you can share it with email, Dropbox, whatever app you have installed, and it has the share function. You can use that as a mechanism to share something. You can also specify what file name you want to use to save the file. And then set background pixel color is kind of cool because even if you have a background image, you can alter that. This allows you to alter the background image when you loaded. Okay, it's not going to be saved back into the image file itself. It will just be inside the canvas, but it will still be useful. Are there any questions about the canvas?
How, if you would have different devices with different dimensions, how it will work?
I think App Inventor normalizes all the different screens to the same size.
Which size?
So the size that we see is not the actual size in pixels, because every single app has, I think, 300 something pixels across. Even on my Nexus 5, which is supposed to be 1080p resolution.
Oh, so it does have a fixed
Yeah, it
size.
rescales the actual thing. Yeah.
Oh, okay. And
Yeah.
X and Y, those X and Y, so we can define on
I
this,
believe
right?
so. Yeah. So you kind of have to try it out on different devices and see what it reports back. Because you can make a component as big as the parent, like an image or whatever,
Yeah.
and then check back and see what is the actual width and the height of the object. I think they are pretty much the same. It rescales, everything. I think the width is always rescaled, and then the height is proportional to the width, so things won't look distorted, but it will. But width-wise, it's always 300 something pixels, virtual pixels. Okay, so now we talk about sprites. There are two types of sprites. One is called an image sprite, where you can control the actual image. The other one, which is before this one, is called a ball sprite. And a ball sprite is really easy. It just looks like a ball. Okay, that's all. There we go. It's a ball. It has a few properties. You can enable whether it moves or not. You can control its heading direction. You can control how often the location is updated. And you can also control the speed, which is the number of pixels in the direction that you're specifying in heading. So these three things, heading, interval, and speed, collectively will affect how the sprite moves on your screen. Okay? This one is easy. Visibility, whether the sprite is actually visible in the canvas or not. You always know the XY coordinate of the sprite. So what about Z? Z is how the sprite should be layered relative to other sprites. So the higher the number, the more they should be in front of the other sprites. Now that can come in handy, okay, depending on what you're doing. For instance, if you have a game where you have tanks and airplanes from the top view, the planes should have a higher Z value because they are always visible. They should go over the tanks. And then the tanks will be going over the terrain if you want the terrains to be sprites too. Okay. Now, why would I want the terrain to be a sprite? I mean, that doesn't make any sense.
So that it's an object that can be have events and interact with it. So that
Yes.
you like blow up the side of the mountain and make pieces of the mountain fall away.
Landmines.
Landmine.
You can make a landmine as a sprite, so it's normally invisible. But when a tank goes over a landmine, it generates an event of, okay, you're now over that. And now you can use the explosion animation. Now, a ball cannot do that. Okay, a ball is basically just a ball. You can control the radius, you can control the color and stuff like that, but you can't really control the image. So you cannot really emulate an explosion.
So the ball would be good for the bullet.
It would just be a ball. It's just circular. Okay, anything circular can be implemented by a ball. So if you want to implement something that looks like a real explosion with fireball and stuff like that, you want to use an image sprite, because with an image sprite, you can specify the picture. So the picture is basically a bitmap that is displayed where the sprite is, and you can control the size of the picture too. So that means if you want to display an explosion animation, I'm not 100% sure whether they can specify an animated GIF as a picture. Somebody can try that, okay? I'm not 100% sure. But if it's not possible, all you have to do is to time it, okay? Use a timer and just say every 15 milliseconds, okay? Give me a tick. And then with that take, with every take, you change the picture to the next one in sequence. So now you can basically display the animated sequence of an explosion. So you can make it fancy. And if you do something like that, just make sure that you specify I think it's the alpha channel correctly, not the alpha. You want to specify certain pixels to be transparent. So that, is that the alpha channel? Okay. So you want to make sure that you use a format where the alpha channel can be specified. Because I think GIFs cannot specify that, but PNG can. Yep.
You can have transparency in GIFs also.
Hmm?
Pretty sure.
You can do transparency in GIFs. Then it's JPEG that cannot do it. So JPEG cannot do. Yeah. So that gives you all kinds of options. And then the best thing about an image. And then the best thing about an image sprite is not just that you can change the picture, but you can also do rotation. So now you can have a spaceship that can turn around, and you actually get a sense of direction. Now the problem with an image sprite when it comes to rotation and stuff like that is the collision of one sprite against some other sprites is based on, if I remember correctly, is based on its position before rotation. Okay, so you might want to read about that a little bit. Okay, so collision with handling, called when two sprites collide. Note that checking for collision with a rotated image sprite currently checks against the sprite's unrotated position, which is kind of bad in a way if you want to do this in the game. Because what it means is if you have a really long-ish kind of sprite, it will check for collision before the rotation. But with a long object, rotation can change the geometry a lot. So when you detect a collision, maybe it should not be colliding because the thing is supposed to be arranged like this. So this is something that you kind of have to look into and kind of make sure that whatever you do with sprites, this does not become a big issue. Just kind of avoid longish, thing that can rotate. If it doesn't rotate, it's not an issue. It's just when it rotates, then become an issue. Now sprites have other things that are really cool, because as sprites, they can generate these events. So when a sprite runs into something else, it can generate a collide with event. So this is really great because you don't have to check whether your projectile is hitting something or not. When it does hit something, it will let you know. Then you can process and go like, okay, what did I collide with? A friendly, an enemy, or the wall because I just got out of range. You can also detect whether a sprite is getting dragged. Now, you have to be careful with this one because when you drag a sprite, it doesn't actually move the sprite. It simply means that the drag movement starts with the sprite. So the sprite itself is not actually moved by the drag event. If you want the drag event to actually move the sprite, you have to do it. You have to change the XY location of the sprite according to the drag event. So the drag event does not automatically move the sprite. It simply says somebody is long touching a sprite and doing something with it. Yep.
So if you're dragging a sprite and reporting the XYs, then you can go back and update your sprite's position.
You can mirror
match those XYs.
if that is what your app wants to do.
Okay.
Yep. And when your sprite is going beyond all the other sprites and now it's hitting the edge, that generates an event, which is really cool. Because when your sprite is no longer in the game area, it has exited the entire window, exited the entire canvas. This will be generated, so oh, it's time for me to reuse that particular sprite, because you can only have a certain number, a constant number of sprites. So you have to recycle your projectile sprites. You cannot just say, oh, give me a new one. Doesn't do it that way. The edges are numbered. If you just read it, it just has numbers, corresponding to each edge and corner of the entire screen. It can do the flung thing too, okay? And it also has this really kind of cool thing, no longer colliding with. So if one sprite is kind of big and the other one is flying over it, when it exits the other sprite, it generates an event as well. It can be useful, but I guess typically it's not as useful. Yep.
You could use that if you were doing some sort of collision detection detection. So if you have your sprite moving and then it collides with something, you could just manually have your program push it out with until it's no longer colliding with.
Yep.
But I guess it's the negation of is colliding with.
No, it's not, because this is not a negation of colliding with, because this one is when you're exiting. It only is a one-time issue. It's a one-time event.
Okay. I guess it could be.
Yep. So we are running out of time. For those of you who want to experiment with Canvas today, you can do that. We will definitely play with this on Wednesday, along with some JavaScript stuff. So what I'm doing is I am listening to what your project has to do, and then I'm just going over the features of App Inventor that will be useful for your apps. Okay. So I'm gonna